Usually there is a quite a competition for some dressers, especially if they're mid-century modern and if they're for free. But this one, nobody wanted it. Hi, I'm Alona and I'm a garbage picker. Welcome to another makeover. The dresser was in pretty rough shape. The veneer on the sides at the bottom edges was broken. A big chip from the left side I found in one of the drawers, and the right side was not too bad compared to the left side. Two drawers were kind of broken, and the third one, let's say it was disassembled. And it was missing the bottom and the back panels. First, I started dealing with those broken drawers. Two of them had peeling veneer on the inside, and initially I was gonna save it because I kept finding those parts, missing parts here and there. But when I had a closer look, I realized that it would be better if I just peeled this whole veneer off. First, I disassembled the drawers. I mean, they were kind of disassembled already, so I just finished the job. And then I started peeling off the veneer, and I was right. The glue had dried almost everywhere. I had my heat gun prepared, but I didn't really need it. There were a couple of stubborn spots, but I just needed to find the right edge to pry it. I peeled sub-veneer off two of the drawer fronts, and I didn't throw it out. I saved larger pieces because sometimes I need those pieces to do some repairs in sub-veneer. On the third drawer front, the veneer looked pretty good. Someone has attempted to repair it with some wood filler, but it didn't work without some wood glue. One of the bottom panel was missing as well as a drawer slider, and it looked like those sliders were custom made for this piece, so I couldn't find anything like that on Amazon. So what do we do in this case? Right, we build it. Even though I'm not professional carpenter, I always try to do my best. Or maybe I just like to make my life more complicated. But in this case, I didn't have any choice. It was easier and way cheaper to build this slider myself instead of replacing all 9 sliders. I recently disassembled 2 side tables. There was nothing wrong with them, they were solid oak, it's just nobody wants them anymore. It's not worth to refinish them, but it's always nice to have some pieces of solid oak in my stash. And that was what I was trying to build a new slider out of. First, I measured everything and I cut the edges, and then I was gonna use my router to cut the groove inside of this piece. And that's how I figured that my poor small router is not powerful enough to go through solid oak. In 1 minute, my router was so hot, and I think I even saw some smoke coming out of it. So I came up with a plan B. I didn't have any pieces of birch or maple thick enough to cut the groove in there and make the slider, but I had a whole bunch of thinner pieces, and this one was actually part of the mirror holder from other dresser. It was the perfect size, so all I needed just to cut it in half. Yes, it is a smoke. I have to buy a new blade for my miter saw. And how do you like my new dust collection system? That was just a temporary solution because it takes a while to hook up my vacuum to my miter saw, and I didn't want to do it again because I just disassembled everything. Then I cut the piece of 1/2-inch plywood to the size of my slider, and then I glued 2 pieces I just pre-cut to this piece of plywood. So here you see me gluing and clamping the first piece, but once it's dried, I did the same thing to the other one. And this way I had exactly the same slider, it was just not a solid piece of wood. But if it works, who cares? Once I was done with the slider, I needed to recreate a missing bottom panel and the back panel. As a template, I used those parts from the other drawers. I transferred the templates on the sheet of plywood I had on hand, and then I realized that it's way too big for my little table saw. And there's no way I can make the cuts right without help. But I'm a stubborn person, and if I started doing something, I have to do it right away. I can't set it aside, so I decided to go with my jigsaw. And what can I say? It was kind of awkward, but I managed to do that. The back panel I decided to do from the same plywood. The original back panel was a little bit thicker, but the difference between thicknesses of plywood I had on hand and the original backboard was like 1/8 of inch, so I thought it wasn't a big deal. Once I was done with the hardest part, I moved on to the stripping of old finish. To do that, I used my favorite chemical stripper. It's circa 1850 and it's a liquid formula. I used to use only gel formula before, but then I figured that liquid formula works pretty much the same way for me and it's a little bit cheaper. And this dresser could be a good example of the fact that if your stripping goes well, you don't need any sanding after. Of course, if you don't have any scratches or dents or any other damages. In this case, I had lots of scratches and dents, but anyways, I wanted to try to follow all the rules of right stripping I learned from different restorators. And first of all, I applied the first coat of stripper. My stripper worked awesome with this top coat, and I was able to scrape off most of the finish. Then I started working in the sections and I applied a thinner coat of my stripper and I took very fine steel wool. Usually I use fine steel wool, but I was out of it. So I took my very fine steel wool and I wiped off any residue of old finish what was left on the surface. And that was pretty much all I needed because I had a smoothest surface with no lacquer on it. My next step would be to use some methyl hydrate or mineral spirit to do like a little wash with the same steel wool in case if there is any residue of old lacquer left. But in my case, it didn't make any sense because there were multiple scratches on each and every drawer front. So for all other drawers, I didn't do the steel wool step because I was gonna sand them anyways. The drawers are done, now it's time to move on to the body of the dresser. First, I gave it a really good clean because gosh, it was dirty. It stayed in my garage and of course it collected dust, but it was so dirty inside. I usually just vacuum the back panel from the inside, but here I decided to wipe it with my rag and oh my god, I think I'm gonna be doing it to all my pieces now. And I know that the back panel, that part is never gonna be touched or seen, but still, my rag was like black almost. Once this lady was all clean, I started stripping it. On the top as usual, the lacquer was way thicker, so I ended up applying 3 coats on my stripper. And this lacquer was methyl hydrate sensitive and I even tried to use that, but we have really dry air here in Alberta and methyl hydrate evaporates so fast, so it just was easier to use my stripper. Because of the damage on the sides of the dresser, I was thinking about keeping the top and the drawers front wooden and paint the rest of the dresser. And it would be way easier and less time consuming because the way the dresser is. But it seems like I'm not that type of person who picks the easy way. That is why you see me stripping those grooves on the front part of the dresser. And actually, it wasn't too bad. I applied some stripper and then I used my aluminum wire brush and some steel wool and it worked. The sides of the dresser I decided to strip as well because I can always paint them, right? So let's try to restore them first. I wanted to try to put back that piece of the veneer I found in one of the drawers. I knew that wouldn't be perfect and I would have to do some more manipulation to try to blend it in. In theory, I could have just cut the veneer a little bit more and straight and then to make a patch. But in reality, since we moved, I couldn't find the box with the pieces of the veneer I could use as a patches. I mean, I didn't even know I lost it. I wasn't looking for it until that moment. The chipboard was a little bit destroyed at the edge, so I had to recreate those missing chips. I like using epoxy glue for repairs like that, and also sometimes I use it as a wood glue, especially since I found the cheap version at the dollar store. This tube cost $2.75 Canadian versus 15 or something at Home Depot, but I didn't see any difference so far. It works just fine for me. So here's an example how I use it as a wood filler. I mix 2 parts as usual and then I add some wood chips. I love that it hardens as a rock and it stays sustainable. In the ideal situation, it's better to use some wood dust after sanding the same wood. In my case, I didn't have it, so I used some wood chips. While my epoxy was hardening, I moved on to sanding the drawer fronts. I started with 100 grit sandpaper because, like I said, I had multiple scratches on the surfaces and I was hoping to get rid of some of them with sanding. I also sanded my disassembled back panels and bottom panels with 180 grit sandpaper. Once I was done with the first round of sanding, my epoxy has completely hardened. I took off all my clamps and weight, and I noticed some gaps and grooves here and there. So I mixed one more batch of my epoxy wood filler with the wood chips, and I applied it to those gaps. Meanwhile, my handmade drawer slider was ready to be used. I sanded it smooth with 180 grit, applied some liquid nails, put it on the drawer bottom, and put some weight on top. After sanding with 120, many of the scratches disappeared, but there were still some deeper scratches left. In cases like this, I use a hot iron and I try to steam them out. I usually spray scratches with some water and I let it penetrate for a little bit, like for 15 seconds or so. And then I put a rag over it and I use my iron. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. It all depends how deep the scratch is. Thankfully, I didn't have a lot of deep scratches except for the one of the drawers front. And I just had to live with that. It's a part of the piece. After steaming, I sanded all drawer fronts with 180 grit sandpaper. By the time I was done with the drawers, the epoxy on the side was completely hardened and I sanded it with 120 grit. I can't say that it turned out perfect, but it was pretty good. The dovetail joint on one of the smaller drawers was loose, but the other side was pretty sturdy, so I didn't disassemble the whole thing. I just fixed one side. I also put together my disassembled drawers. Two of them I did off camera, and this is the third one with my custom built bottom part and back panel. Everything looked okay except for one little thing. The plywood I used, the sheet of plywood, it wasn't perfectly flat. I was hoping that everything would be okay once I put the parts in the grooves and assembled the whole drawer, but it didn't happen. But anyways, before I can do anything about it, I have to let the joints dry. So I set the drawer aside and moved back to the body of the dresser. I was gonna add new legs to this piece, so I no longer needed those casters. The bottom of the dresser didn't look bad, but I just decided to smooth it out with 180 grit sandpaper. I had some chip veneer on the other side of the dresser, but it wasn't that bad as the other one. To fix this problem, instead of using epoxy, I went with the wood filler. The joints on the drawer dried and I was ready to get back to it and try to fix. I wanted to add the trim in the back and then just nail my boards to the trim, both the bottom board and the back board. The wood filler had dried and I was ready to sand the whole body of the dresser. The first round was with 120 grit sandpaper, and after that I still had some scratches on the top. And once again I used my iron and a damp cloth and I tried to steam them out, and this time successfully. After steaming, I sanded the whole piece with 180 grit sandpaper. But this time, once I was done sanding with my orbital sander and 180 grit sandpaper, I went over again with 180, but I did it with my hands because I had so many swivel marks, and no matter how bad I tried to get rid of them with a sander, with orbital sander, they were still there. The front of the dresser, wherever I was able, I sanded with my sander, and I finished with hand sanding again. There were a couple of small chips on the top. To fill them in, I used my hard wax stick in the color walnut. I melted it into the hole using the tool I don't even know the name of. And once it's dried, I scraped the excess of it with a blade and then sanded it with 180. And here's the moment of truth. To decide if I'm going to paint the sides or to restore them, I applied very thin wood stain in the color Early American. And it looked fine to me. I could work with that. So restoration it is. The front frame was made, of course, out of different type of wood. It was birch. To match the color of the dresser, I first applied water-based wood stain in the color American Walnut. And I did the same to the sides of the drawer fronts because there were no veneer on them. This water-based stain dried so fast, so by the time I was done with the drawers, the body of the dresser was ready to be worked with. Next, I applied oil-based wood stain. It was very thin in the color Early American. To achieve that uniform look, I applied the stain to the whole body and to the drawers, except for one drawer, because that drawer needed my attention. First of all, I nailed the bottom board and the back board to the plank I added to the back. And because of me being lazy to assemble my table saw and trim this plank into the thickness I needed, I have to deal with that now because I couldn't leave it just as is. And I didn't come up with any better idea than using my little planer. Once I was done, I applied Early American stain to this drawer as well. While the stain was drying, I did the legs. I ordered them from Amazon and obviously they didn't match the color. So I sanded them first with 120 and 180 grit sandpaper and then applied American Walnut water-based stain. And oh my god, I don't know what kind of top coat was on those legs, but I just couldn't sand it. I mean, I could, but in some spots, it's just stayed there no matter how hard I sanded. And the worst thing, after sanding, it looked like it was sanded, but once I applied the stain, I found out that my sanding job was not that good. I decided just to let it dry and then resand those spots again. but it didn't work. I resanded just those spots, reapplied the stain, still there. I did it probably twice, and then I just decided to give up and do something different. First, I applied a thick layer of water-based stain without wiping it off. I just let it dry as is, and then I did the same with oil-based stain. I let the stain dry over the night, and next morning I sealed the whole piece with wipe on poly. Once the first coat of poly dried, I started the blending job. In this case, I mostly used the same oil-based stain, Wear Thin, in the color Early American. It worked great and it helped to blend all those repairs. I didn't film the whole process. I just applied the stain and then I let it dry. Then I sealed it with some poly because I didn't have a wood sealer. And then I repeated the same process probably 2 times. And then to add a darker shade, I used dark walnut wood stain and some wood markers from Home Depot. And once I was done with blending, I sealed the whole piece with 3 coats of wipe on poly. And we're pretty much ready to see the final results, but here I wanted to be completely honest with you guys, there was something behind the scene. I applied 3 coats of poly and something weird was happening. As usual, I applied the first coat, let it dry, and then I did between coats sanding with 400 grit sandpaper, not even with 150 like it's recommended on the jar. But even 400 grit sandpaper still leaves some little scratches, like micro scratches on the top. And usually how it works with the top coat, the next coat is supposed to penetrate with the previous coat. And all those micro scratches are supposed to disappear, but it wasn't happening. I could see all tracks of sanding in between coats. And again, it was 400 grit sandpaper. And it wasn't quite visible from the first look. I mean, like it didn't catch your eye. But in natural light, especially in the sun, if you looked at the dresser from different angles, you could see those scratches. I was so frustrated, I kept adding more coats, and it didn't work. I ended up refinished this top 2 more times. I used water-based poly instead wipe on poly, and anyways, every time something went wrong. Little things like the top coat didn't want self-level. At the end, it turned out not as perfect as I wanted it to be, but I just didn't have any energy to refinish this top for the 3rd time. So this is how this dresser looked before, and here's the after. And you won't see any of those imperfections, but I just know about them. That's why probably I can see them. Nobody else can. This is the repairs I made and I think I did a pretty good job. It's almost blended in. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching and see you in my next video.